I want to thank you, Brad, and everyone that worked so hard to organize this symposium. It's, as always, a pleasure to be here with our community. It's been fantastic so far, and I think all the organizers and all the speakers up to now deserve a big hand. Particularly in the context of this moment, I want to thank the panelists that preceded me. I thought that was a very interesting, rich discussion, as they all tend to be. And we're sharing a lot of good information here. I noticed that we're about an hour behind schedule. So we do have the option of we could just can this and go to lunch, but I don't think we're going to do that. I mean, you can if you want, but I'm kind of stuck here. So what I'm going to share with you today is mostly a lot of it's personal reminiscence or reflection. Ayahuasca, in some ways, I better leave that alone or I'm going to ruin it, and then, I don't know. Ayahuasca has been a big part of my life for not quite 45 years, but almost. And I've been involved with it on both professionally and as a personal ally and teacher. And I really honestly have to say that in some ways, in the last 50 years, I owe almost all the interesting things that ever happened to me to ayahuasca, directly or indirectly. It's been quite an experience to be in symbiosis or in alliance with this amazing medicine. So I'm going to share some of that history with you. There's not a lot of technical stuff, a little bit of the science, but just basically tell you, my story and how I got to this place and what it's meant for me. And of course, there'll be various moments of shameless self-promotion, such as this one. This is the first one. This is my memoir, which I wrote in 2012. And there are copies in the room where they're selling books. And I'm running out of softcover copies, so you really need to buy it. I want to clear out my storage unit back in Minnesota, and I'm trying to, so I'm aggressively flogging these books. However, there is if you want to know the backstory and the kind of stuff I really can't talk about here and wouldn't if I could, you can buy the book and learn sort of my the story of my dissolute past and stumbling road along the road to trying to learn something from the plants. Some of you are familiar, of course, with the mythology, I guess you could say, the Terry and Denny story. We first went to La Chorrera in the Colombian Amazon in 1971, together with three of our similarly passionate and possibly misguided friends. At that time, we didn't know from ayahuasca. We didn't know very much about ayahuasca. And in fact, in 1971, not very much was known. For example, the role of the admixture plants in ayahuasca was only beginning to emerge. And it was only later that it was clarified that it really is an orally active form of DMT, as we all know, due to its mechanism of action. At that time, we didn't know that. We were looking for another orally active form of DMT, a very obscure Witoto hallucinogen, which they called ukuhe. And we had stumbled on this reference to ukuhe in a botanical museum leaflet by Richard Schultes called Varola as an orally active hallucinogen. And Varola, as you may know, there are a number of species of trees in the Myristicaceae, the nutmeg family, and in various parts of the Amazon, the sap of Varolas, many species, is very high in DMT, 5-methoxy DMT, and other tryptamines. And various tribes in the Amazon prepare snuffs from this sap of the Varola. And they use that, and by being snuffs, it gets around this whole need to inhibit MAO, as they were talking about earlier. But we were interested in finding an orally active form of DMT because we were obsessed with DMT, is what it came down to. But we were frustrated by the shortness of the experience. About all you can say about DMT, it's astonishing, but then it's over in 10 minutes, so then what do you say? So we were looking for something that maybe could extend that state. We could spend more time in that dimension, and that's kind of how we thought of it. And we heard about this orally active form of Varola, used by the Watoto at this place at the ends of the earth called La Chirera. And so we were completely obsessed with this. We were students. My brother was at Berkeley, I was at Boulder. We gave all that up, and we headed out for the Colombian Amazon in 1971 in search of ukuhe, as they called it. And this shows our merry band. This is actually the original Brotherhood of the Screaming Abyss. We called ourselves that, kind of tongue-in-cheek. I mean, you know, we were on a hero's quest, or maybe a fool's quest, who knows. But we were looking for a secret, and we got to La Chirera, and this is shortly after our arrival. We were resting. We had to cross a trail through the jungle from one river to another over 4 days. It was quite a stressful trip. In fact, I'm amazed we survived in some ways. But we're resting, and this is some of our, I don't know if this light will work. This is one of our bands, a woman named Sarah Hartley. This is me. This is my brother doing what he does so well, rolling a joint. His girlfriend of just a few weeks, and another anthropologist gentleman, Michael Lasky. So that was the Brotherhood of the Screaming Abyss. And this is what we were looking for. We were looking for various Varola species, particularly this species. Generically, Varolas are called kumalas in the Amazon, and the Watotos called this ukuhe. So we were thinking that we called this the secret, because we kind of thought of DMT as the secret as well. And, you know, so we were looking for ukuhe. This was the holy grail as far as we were concerned. When he eventually found ukuhe, it turned out not to be so amazing as we thought. Well, when we got to La Chirera, we found that they had cleared the pastures around this little Capuchin mission settlement, really just a few buildings with a church and, you know, where the padre lived and so on. And they cleared pasture around it, and in those pastures they put Cebu cattle, the white humpbacked Cebu cattle. That happens to be, the dung of those cattle happens to be the preferred substrate for this creature, Psilocybe cubensis, the mushroom teacher, the pan-tropical psilocybin mushroom. You can find this in, you know, misty pastures pretty much anywhere in the world. It's really a global mushroom. And when we were on the way into La Chirera, we'd been warned by an anthropologist who was very unhappy to see us when we showed up at the village downriver where he had been working with the Watoto. And we walked into that village unannounced. There was no way you could send an email in those days or a text. So we just walked in, and I assure you we were far more colorful looking than any of the Watoto. We looked like we'd stepped right out of Haight-Ashbury, which more or less we had. This was, you know, I mean, some of our people had beards down to their waist, a lot of beads and, you know, bling and that sort of thing. We were a colorful bunch, I tell you. And we showed up, and this anthropologist was like, where did you come from? And more importantly, why are you here? And so we said, well, you know, we're here to find ukuhe. And that really upset him, because it was like, how did you find out of this? You're not even supposed to know about this, right? Well, you know, Schultes published a paper, and this is what we're here for. And, you know, so lead us to the ukuhe doc. And he wasn't too ready to do that. And he said, well, you can't just walk into the village and start talking about this. This is like big shamanic magic. They're not going to tell you, and they may kill you. We said, yeah, whatever. You know, but actually when we went overland from that village to La Chorrera, it has sort of sunk in. And so we went to this village and we thought, you know, we'll hang around, we'll be discreet and make discreet inquiries. But then what we found were these mushrooms everywhere, pretty much huge, big, beautiful clusters growing out of every cowpipe, because that was the rainy season. And we had a very cavalier attitude toward this. We thought, oh, these will be great. You know, I mean, we knew what they were. We had absolutely no experience with them, but we'd done our homework, and we thought, oh, wonderful. We can play with these while we're waiting for the real secret to show up. Well, the mushrooms quickly rearranged our priorities. You know, we started eating them. We actually started incorporating them into our diet, which was probably not a good idea. There wasn't a whole lot to eat. And you'd be amazed what a good omelet or, you know, mushroom soup. And they're a good additive to these things. So we kind of got into this low-level state of being be-mushroomed all the time. And it stimulated conversations. Boy, did it stimulate conversations. And it stimulated ideas, and that whole thing is chronicled in my brother's book, True Hallucinations, and my own to a certain extent, The Brotherhood of the Screaming Abyss. But this mushroom kind of got us off track in terms of what we thought we'd come for. And what we had come for, what we'd actually come for was for the encounter with this mushroom, the mushroom teacher, and you know, it's really, that was really a pivotal point of the rest of both of our lives. Well, I'm not going to bore you with that. You can read all about that and our misadventures in these various books. But 10 years later, I returned to Peru this time as a graduate student at the University of British Columbia. And we went downriver from Iquitos. How many people have been to Iquitos here? A few, right. Iquitos is kind of now the epicenter of the whole ayahuasca tourism thing, or one of the epicenters. Well, when I got there in 1981, it was not. It was a sleepy little river town, and nobody'd ever heard of ayahuasca. There was certainly no ayahuasca tourism. There were a few anthropologists and ethnobotanists that were interested in it, pretty much opaque to everyone else. So this will just geographically orient you a bit. This is La Chorrera up here on the Rio Igar Paraná. This is the Rio Putumayo, which separates Peru on the south and Colombia on the north. We went down the Putumayo to this river, the Rio Paraná, up to El Encanto, and then across this gap to La Chorrera. Well, in 1981, we went, here is Iquitos, we went down the Amazon and up to a town called Pebas, then up the Rio Ampiacu, which means the river of poisons. And why did we go here? One of the things we were looking for was again, ukuhe. Well, the Watoto had more or less been forcibly displaced from La Chorrera during the rubber boom. There were only remnants of the culture there. Most of them had moved down to this area in the Ampiacu, so we thought we could, you know, reconnect with the Watoto culture there. And this is a few, a few pictures. And this is a long story, but one of the people going with us was Wade Davis, who happened to be working with the RV Heraclitus, which was in Iquitos at the time. And so the RV Heraclitus had run into a barge on its way up the Amazon, so it wasn't able to take us down there. But they had another skiff, and there was a couple of other ways to get down there. So Wade was with us, and my brother also, during this period of my expedition, had sort of invited himself along. I mean, you know, and what could I say? But he wasn't really part of the university expedition, but I told him he could come as long as he didn't cause trouble. Well, Yeah, that didn't work so well. But anyway, he came, and then we went to this place, and we wanted to collect kumala, these various samples of these Varroa trees, and also get the indigenous people to prepare samples for us. Well, they didn't remember how to do it. They were, some of them sort of remembered. They were really a degraded culture. I mean, they were traumatized culture by their early 20th century experiences with the rubber traders and all that. Hundreds of thousands of people in this area were enslaved, killed. A whole Holocaust occurred there that nobody ever really talks about. There's a couple of books. One of them is called The Devil's Paradise, which is a description of the history of that area. Pretty appalling, you know, these tribes were enslaved. But at this time, that was all a long time ago. Well, we talked to various informants, and a lot of them just sort of, some of them said, I don't remember, my grandfather did it, or I don't even know, I don't want to talk about it. But a few of them were willing to talk about it and even try to reproduce it, even though it was, you know, kind of a lost art. One of the gentlemen here said he would try it, and so he showed us, you know, the preparation of it, and eventually came up with a sample of ukuhe. And of course, being good field ethnopharmacologists, we had to bioassay this. That's what a lab assay is, a large animal bioassay. And it just goes along with the territory. We collected about 7 or so of these samples from different practitioners, and maybe about 3 of them had some kind of activity. Not really psychedelic, more, you know, not physically very comfortable, but this particular one actually turned out to be very high in 5-methoxy DMT when we finally got it back to the lab. And that explains why the effects were a lot like 5-methoxy DMT. Here's my brother after he's on his way home, he's trying to smuggle Varroa seeds out to eventually plant in Hawaii. That didn't, they didn't germinate very well. Okay, so that part of my graduate work actually, you know, took place. I didn't really encounter ayahuasca until later in this trip, and that was when I got into it. This is beautiful examples of the plant. This is many years later. This is a specimen. I don't know if you, yeah, the vine. This is a specimen I took to the land on the Big Island of Hawaii that eventually become Botanical Dimensions. I brought this specimen. I got it from Tim Plowman, who was a student of Schulte's. They had specimens at the Lion Arboretum, and we planted that, and that was 1976. So I guess that's really where the climb began, in a certain sense, and also, well, you know, that original plant was kind of the diaspora of ayahuasca, if you wanted to think of it that way. The first time ayahuasca was introduced, you know, outside the Amazon, and it turns out it loves Hawaii. There's lots and lots of ayahuasca being grown in Hawaii now. This particular specimen, being quite old, is certainly one of the mother plants. You know, it's quite large. I mean, it weighs several tons. The central trunk is as big as my central trunk. It's, you know, 1,500 feet long. So these are not, these are very robust plants. Some of the biggest plants on Earth are lianas, not trees, and ayahuasca is a liana. And then the other admixture plant, which was collected later on later expeditions, we also introduced into Botanical Dimensions on the Big Island. So that's the plant, and as you know, ayahuasca is made from at least 2 plants: the vine itself, Banisteriopsis caapi, in the Malpighiaceae family, and then various admixture plants, most commonly in the Amazon, chacruna, the middle one, Psychotria viridis. And north of the Putumayo, often another species is used, Diploteris cabarena, or chagroponga. That's also a vine, and it's in the same family as ayahuasca. But the leaves of chagroponga contain DMT, just like chacruna. So north of the Putumayos, the custom has been to use Diploteris cabarena as the admixture plant. And some anthropologists say that's the distinction between ayahuasca and yahe. Yahe is made with chagroponga, localized north of the Putumayo, and chacruna is much more widespread through the Amazon basin. And as you know, I don't think we have to belabor this, but ayahuasca, among most of the traditional psychedelics, has a unique pharmacology in that the Banisteriopsis, the vine, contains alkaloids that inhibit monoamine oxidase, and DMT, orally active, is broken down in the gut if there's not an MAO inhibitor. So people have figured out that if you combine these, if you prepare them together, monoamine oxidase inhibitors in the vine will prevent the breakdown of DMT and render it orally active. So that's pretty clever, you know, for primitive savages to figure this out, and they did indeed. They figured out a lot of other things as well. So this is just the chemistry. The alkaloids in the middle are the beta-carbolines. They're indoles, like dimethyltryptamine there. 3 major beta-carbolines in ayahuasca: harmine, harmaline, and tetrahydroharmine. They're all indolic alkaloids. They're all MAO inhibitors, and tetrahydroharmine also has some serotonin reuptake activity as well. Well, on this same expedition, this was my main informant, I guess you could say, in Pucallpa. Actually, I went first to Pucallpa, and I met up with Don Fidel Mozambite. I had the connection because Terence and Kat, his wife at the time, had been to Pucallpa a couple of years previously, so I had a connection when I got to Pucallpa. And Don Fidel turned out to be a wonderful connection. He's the real deal. He was the real deal. He knew his plants. He was a good curandero. He did beautiful ceremonies and made beautiful medicines. And he was happy to share his knowledge with us. You can imagine how surprised he must have been when these 2 gringos stumbled into his courtyard, into his front yard, and said, "Tell us everything you know about ayahuasca," in broken Spanish, and I mean really broken Spanish at that time. And actually he invited us to stick around, and he was kind enough to share his ayahuasca with us and show us how to prepare it and all that. So he got it, and he was really, you know, wonderful, I guess, first encounter with a traditional healer that turned out to be very good. He was part of a long lineage of this tradition called vegetalismo. Another one of the same lineage up in Iquitos was Don Emilio Andrade. And he comes out of the same traditional lineage of what I sometimes called the old school of vegetalismo. And at the time I was doing my work in Pucallpa, my friend Dr. Luis Eduardo Luna was up in Iquitos, learning from Don Emilio and doing a film about him, which is actually still out there. One of the first ayahuasca films, he called it Don Emilio y sus doctorcitos, Don Emilio and his little doctors. Very interesting, not high quality cinematically, but a very sweet little film just because it's so amateur essentially, and it's basically Don Emilio talking about his life. You can still see it on YouTube, it's out there. Another famous ayahuasquero of the same lineage, Don Jose Corral, and just another one that was known and well respected in the community. This is Don Jose at age 99. That was the last time that I encountered Don Jose. Here's another person that I've been privileged to work with, in the Amazon for ever since I got there. This is Juan Ruiz. And Juan Ruiz Macedo, who is not a shaman, not a curandero. He's the director of the herbarium at the National University of the Amazon in Iquitos. And when I first got to Iquitos, he was a forestry student, and he was the person, poor fellow, that was designated to take these two gringos out and help them, you know, find the plants they needed, but more importantly, get them back alive. And he did that. He was a wonderful but very taciturn guide, and he took us out, and and he's helped many a graduate student in that way. Well, we formed a friendship, and actually we still work together. Now he is the director of the herbarium. And this man's knowledge, I can't say enough about it. He's got so much knowledge about these plants, and it's all in here. I said, you've got to write this stuff down. You know, this is a valuable knowledge. He said, why? I already know it all. Such a great guy. I mean, you can hand him a fragment of a leaf or a piece of bark. Usually he can give you the scientific name, the common name, what it's used for, and usually a funny story about some botanist that came through and collected it 20 years ago. I mean, he has an eidetic memory and tells, you know, he's just a prince of a guy, open-hearted, extremely knowledgeable man, and one of those resources of knowledge that Mark Plotkin refers to when he says, when a medicine man dies, it's as though a library has burned down. Juan is the library. And, you know, I hope that we can find a way to preserve what he knows. Anyway, so I continued on my work, and I eventually, eventually, like all good graduate students, I published a couple papers out of this work in the Journal of Ethnopharmacology, which was barely getting started at that time. One was on ayahuasca, and one was on my work with ukuhe. The one about ayahuasca kind of launched my career, and the one about ukuhe disappeared into the depths of, you know, the archives of biomedicine, and nobody ever paid any attention to it, although it was pretty interesting as well. But the paper on ayahuasca did get attention, and in some ways opened doors for me as a graduate, as a postdoc, and so on. So I got this stuff, all these samples, eventually back to the lab, and I spent the next 3 years sorting it out, analyzing them, doing pharmacology, measuring the MAO inhibiting activity, and so on. When I got these samples, when I finished my field work, I took a red eye from Lima to Vancouver. I showed up about 4 in the morning, and I had all these duffel bags of samples and plant presses and all this stuff I'd collected, and I looked pretty wild-eyed myself, having been in the jungle for 6 months or so. And I came to the customs agent and dumped my stuff out, and I said, don't worry, I have permits for all this, you know, it's all UBC, it's all kosher, and would you like to see my permits? And she looked at this array of stuff on the table and said, you know, you're the people my supervisor warned me about. And she said, just get out of here. So I did. And I took a cab to the university, and that began. So I finished up my PhD in '84, and then a couple of years later, I was invited by Eduardo Luna to Bogota to a conference organized by the International Association of the Americanists. He had organized a satellite symposium on ayahuasca, the first one of the first ones. So we went to the University of the Andes, and one of the people presenting, this gentleman here, was much younger, Guillermo Arevalo. He was, some of you may know of him, and he was a young ayahuasquero, Shipibo ayahuasquero, and also studying plants making an ethnobotanical collection and so on. So we presented there, and then after that I went with Eduardo, who is Colombian. He grew up in Florencia in the Caquetá province of southern Colombia. So after the conference, he took me to visit his family in Florencia, his younger brother there, and guess what? They had pastures, and guess what grew in those pastures? That's one reason they look so happy. Yeah. So I had a wonderful time meeting his family, and then we went on to Pucallpa, Eduardo and I together, because I wanted to introduce Eduardo to Don Fidel in Pucallpa. And when we got to Pucallpa, I had previously in 1981, I had met a gentleman who walked up to me in a bar. I was enjoying a beer, and he said in perfect English, "Can I buy you a beer?" I said, "Sure." And as it turned out, he was the local English teacher. It was Pablo Amaringo. I had no idea. And, we talked, and Pablo Amaringo was known to no one at that time. We talked. He mentioned to me that he was an amateur painter. He took me to his house and showed me some paintings of animals and trees and plants in the forest. They were certainly amateurish, and I didn't think too much about it. But when I went back to Pucallpa in 1985, I took Eduardo to meet Pablo Amaringo, just because he was a friend. And in the course of that conversation, with Eduardo's perfect Spanish, we found out that Pablo had actually been a powerful ayahuasquero in his past, and that he had stepped back from it because he had gotten involved in shamanic battles with sorcerers. So he decided to give that up, but he said he remembered all his visions quite perfectly in great detail. And Eduardo asked him, and having shared that he was a painter, Eduardo asked him, "Have you ever thought about painting these visions that you remember?" And it had never occurred to him that he would do that. But you could see the light bulb come on over his head. And the next morning we came back, and he had completed the first of 4 paintings, which he gave to us. And that started his career. He eventually, of course, as you know, painted hundreds of paintings and became world famous for his visionary paintings, founded a whole new tradition of visionary art indigenous to the Amazon. Together, he and Eduardo published this book, which came out in, I think my pointer is failing, anyway, it doesn't matter, in 1995. And this book, I think, was a landmark. It was an important influence in bringing the notion of ayahuasca, something about ayahuasca, to the wider world, because this was published by North Atlantic Press. It was distributed, in lots of bookstores. It became a coffee table book, and it had collection of Pablo's paintings in full color and great detail, and then on the facing page, Eduardo's explanation of what these paintings meant and what all the creatures and symbols and so on meant. So it was like a window onto the Amazonian cosmology of vegetalismo. And it really made it accessible to a lot of people, and I think fascinated a lot of people. And that was really, in some way, the start of this beginning of steady stream of ayahuasca tourism. They wanted to go down and find out what was going on. And Pucallpa and Iquitos became the 2 magnets for the tourists. Also in this same period, Eduardo and Pablo founded a school, the Uscoayar School of Amazonian Painting. And it was just because Pablo wanted to teach the local kids primarily how to paint, not visionary paintings, but realistic paintings. So he essentially opened his house, which was very modest, and invited children of the village to come learn to paint. And many of them did, and some of them have really continued the legacy and actually have become visionary painters, such as Anderson Di Bernardi is one that comes to mind. He is now probably as famous as Pablo and has a very interesting style. So he started that, and actually Pablo became famous for this. He got He got a award from the Rio Summit for his contribution to environmental protection through education. And I was really happy to see that. I'm very proud that I was able to introduce Eduardo to Pablo, and of course we've all been friends for years, you know, some of the time anyway, most of the time. So from that 85 expedition, or I wouldn't call it an expedition, but that trip, one of our associates had collected a bunch of plants that he was keeping in the garden, and was waiting for me to show up so we could take them back, which we did. And we took them originally to San Diego, where the USDA, you know, plant quarantine station did all they could to kill them. You know, by the time we got them out of there, they were just sticks. But Eduardo went on and took them to Hawaii, and that's where Kat and Terrence were living at that time, trying to establish botanical dimensions. They got these plants into the ground, and that became the core, kind of the core collection of what's there at Botanical Dimensions. A lot of the dieta plants that you heard Sita talk about and Joe talk about, most of the dieta plants are there. Lots of ayahuasca, of course, lots of chacruna, and some other interesting things. Okay, so that was all 85. Fast forward to 1991. In 1991, I was invited along with some other scientists that were working in the area of ayahuasca, anthropology or botany or whatever. We were invited by the União de Vegetal, the Brazilian church that uses ayahuasca. They call it huasca. That's the Portuguese transliteration of it. They invited us to a conference, and we all came down and gave our PowerPoints and spent an interesting few days hanging out with the UDV. And it turns out they had a sort of a secret, I wouldn't call it secret, but an agenda that was unofficial. And the agenda that was unofficial was they wanted to do a biomedical study of ayahuasca. They were concerned, the Brazilian regulatory agencies was concerned that ayahuasca was a terrible drug. These were all drug abuse. They were having orgies, you know, they were concerned. This has to be bad, right? The UDV wanted to get outside investigators to do a study on ayahuasca as though that would give it more credibility. So that was their agenda in 1991. And turns out a lot of us had been thinking about the same thing. So I went back to the States, and I was able to cobble some money together from some generous donors who put up some funds. One of the most significant contributors had the last name of Rockefeller, and another one of the donors had the last name of Barnhart, and I think maybe Barnhart is here in the audience someplace, so thank you, Robert. Anyway, we got about 75 grand, which is not a whole lot, but we were able to come back there in 1993 and carry out this study. And we had Brazilian scientists. Dr. Charles Grobe was the principal investigator at that point. And we had scientists from Brazil and Finland, and we carried out this study. And we did it at the Núcleo Calpari, the temple of the UDV in Manaus, Brazil, which was the original temple. And again, I don't know, up there in the corner. And in order to carry out the study, we had to do what they call a preparo. We had to prepare the medicine. Well, the UDV has a big constituency. They have to make enough ayahuasca every 2 weeks or so to serve 10 to 20,000 peoples. So these people do it on an industrial scale, and this just shows some of the stages in the preparo. Interesting event to attend. It takes about 48 hours, and it is a ceremony as much as it is an industrial production process. The ayahuasca has to be tested at every stage along the way, blessings made, all of that. So we did the preparo, And then this is just stages. This is the ayahuasca when it's just about ready, and you notice that rainbow sheen on the surface. That's actually the beta-carbolines. The beta-carbolines are fluorescent, and so one sign they look for is when the sun hits it. If you can see the beta-carboline sheen, then that's a sign that your brew is cooked. And so we didn't have a hospital or anything to do this study. This is really irritating, you know that? All right, I don't know. We just set up shop in the temple, and we had 15 volunteers, and they came every day, and we would hook them up to catheters, and we would collect blood samples and platelet samples so we could do pharmacokinetics. And then did different psychological screenings, you know, the obvious ones: heart rate, blood pressure, pupillary diameter. We took some plasma samples to look at receptor binding profiles, and we administered what you might call psychiatric life story interviews. We had a Portuguese psychiatrist who would do the translation along with Dr. Grobe, and we would transcribe these interviews, which were basically, how did you get into the UDV? What brought you to ayahuasca? So this is in the lower there, that's Dr. Grobe, Jace Calloway, and myself. I think my role at this point was demoted to something like chief test tube labeler or something, but I did. Anyway. So our key findings from this study were interesting. That we found no evidence of acute toxicity. We found no evidence of any neurological, cognitive, or personality dysfunctions in long-term users. In fact, the long-term users on these parameters, which we determined by different questionnaires and, you know, instruments, right? The UDV drinkers were significantly, only slightly, but significantly more better performers than the comparable controls. In other words, their brains function better, is one way to sum it up. Most interestingly, from these life story interviews, we found that most members had come to the UDV because they were in a crisis, often involving alcohol, sometimes drugs, sometimes domestic violence, sometimes the whole mix. And they had usually come to the UDV because a friend had urged them to do so. Most of them reported that their initial experiences were terrifying, and they saw essentially their path, and they saw where they were going off track and what might potentially happen to them if they didn't change their lives. They often had a kind of a beatific vision in a certain way of Mr. Gabriel, who was the founder of the religion. So he was kind of their prophet figure. One fellow said, I saw myself in a canoe, and I was in a canoe and it was going down the river. There were rapids. It was a very narrow canoe, and I was afraid it was going to capsize, but then I looked at the canoe ahead of me, and Mr. Gabriel was standing in the bow of the canoe, and then I knew it was going to be all right. So like that, and they had these redemptive, life-changing experiences, and that they all insisted that you know, being in the UDV was just as important as the medicine for this, having this supportive context for their experiences. Well, so that was interesting. One of the naive questions that we'd asked at the time was, is there any biochemical marker? Is there anything that makes long-term drinkers of ayahuasca different from people that don't drink ayahuasca? We had no idea what we were looking for, but guess what? When we did receptor binding profiles on platelets, which we had collected, platelets are often a peripheral marker for what's going on in the central nervous system. We actually found a significant difference in the abundance or the density of serotonin transporters. Not serotonin, but serotonin transporters. We saw a significant upregulation in serotonin transporters in the long-term drinkers of ayahuasca compared to controls. And I thought, well, what does that mean? you know. I mean, so there is a difference. So what does it mean? Well, we didn't really know, but we did what you do when you're in that. We went into the literature and we found out that there was a literature related to various behavioral abnormalities related to deficits in the serotonin transporters, either suppressed expression of the transporter genes controlling expression or from other causes. And we found that pathologies were related to this transporter deficit. Certain kinds of alcoholism associated with violent or homicidal behavior, suicidal behaviors, binge eating, and other disorders. So you thought, well, that's interesting. Here you have a long-term modulation, upregulation of these serotonin transporters, and you have the behavioral change that it's made in people's lives. It's almost too neat, but there it is. So it suggested that maybe the ayahuasca could actually reverse these deficits, actually raise the expression of the serotonin transporters, and that might be therapeutic. It appeared to be. So this is really as far as this has gone, but it should be investigated more. Ayahuasca is the only pharmacology that I know of, unless there's been other discoveries, that does this, that upregulates the serotonin transporters. So, okay. So yeah, I think so. This is just so we published over the next 8 years after this was. After this study was concluded, we published about 8 peer-reviewed journals or peer-reviewed articles about the results of our study. And it was kind of an inflection point in the interest in ayahuasca research. In 1990, here's the number of publications about ayahuasca-related topics in PubMed, PubMed being the big, the central biomedical database that everybody goes to. So 80, 85, 86, 90, not so much, but here was when we did the study, and then there's almost an exponential rise. If you go to PubMed now and you put in ayahuasca as a keyword, you'll find close to 160 peer-reviewed papers on ayahuasca. So it stimulated interest, and the work goes on. Okay, let's see. Oh, I guess I'm not too far. And discoveries go on. I mean, we thought we pretty well had the chemistry and pharmacology of ayahuasca figured out, but it turns out that harmine, for example, which is what I sometimes call the hoary old alkaloid, it was discovered even before ayahuasca was discovered in Paganum harmala. We kind of thought, harmine was the MAO inhibitor that prevented the breakdown of DMT. Well, it is that, but recent research shows that it does a lot more. It does other things. It interacts with a number of receptors, and it's involved in things like neurogenesis, stimulation of nerve growth. It inhibits this interesting regulatory protein called DYRK1A that has to do with stimulating nerve growth in the hippocampus and also cognitive deficits and a number of other things. And harmine is a very potent inhibitor of that. So harmine, the other beta-carbolines, tetrahydroharmine is another one that's worthy of more investigation. So the beta-carbolines are anything but they're much more than just MAO inhibitors. And they have, other types of activity, like antiviral activity and anti-tumor activity and lots of things. So there's still a lot to sort out in the chemistry of ayahuasca, even though it's been studied for really decades, since the early part of the 20th century. Okay, so I want to skip ahead for a minute. In 2004, I received a grant, most unlikely grant probably ever awarded, from an institution called the Stanley Medical Research Institute. And I had attended a conference sponsored by NIDA, the National Institute of Drug Abuse, and the name of the conference was interesting. It was potential therapeutic applications of illicit plants, right? Illicit plants. I went to this conference, I gave my usual shtick about ayahuasca, and went home. A couple of weeks later, a guy from the Stanley Medical Research contacted me and said, you know, we support schizophrenia research and we're interested in natural products. We have some people working in China looking at Chinese medicines, but we don't have anyone looking at South American medicines. Potentially, would you be interested? He said, well, yeah, we gave away $160 million last year. I said, where do I sign, right? Did not get $160 million, sadly, but I did get about $500,000, and that kept me going for the next 4 years, going to South America and collecting these plants and, you know, reporting the result. This is Alan Shoemaker. Some of you may know him. He's a long-time Iquitos expat, and he and his wife Mariella helped us a lot with logistics. And here's my part of my collection crew, pretty motley crew. Juan Reese there on the right, a couple more. This gentleman on the left, Carlos Pabon, looks like he escaped from an LA gang, but he's actually a brilliant PhD molecular biologist. And our guide for part of this, Aku, went by the name of Aku, Richard Fowler. And Richard Fowler is another Iquitos character. I mean, this guy's colorful. I don't know how good a guide he is, but he was sure fun to have along, you know. He was ex-CIA, ex-special ops, ex-everything, and, you know, a real jungle rat in a certain way. And so he was part of our expedition, and then there's Aku again. Here we are. We went back to Pucurquillo and up the Ampayacu, where I had been there 25 years before. And so this is a Bora headman, village headman, and Aku, and somewhere along the line, a person, a young woman named Sarah Hutt, an independent filmmaker, encountered us in Iquitos, and she wanted to make a film about traditional medicine, not necessarily about ayahuasca, but traditional medicine. So we invited her to you know, tag along and do a film, and this was her, and we caught her just in time. She was going native, but we were managed to, you know, pull her back from that. Anyway, she eventually came up with a little film, which was very nice. Well, I should say this. Eventually, they got a paper out of this work. This is what their $500,000 resulted in ultimately. We used receptor binding, receptor screening techniques. So I think it says receptor screening technologies in the evaluation of Amazonian ethno medicines with potential application to cognitive deficits, okay? And Sarah managed to do it much more entertainingly. She made a little documentary, only about 10 minutes, called The Shaman and the Scientist. And lately we've reconnected and we've been kind of giving this thing around and you know, in different places. And in February, she contacted me and she said, I want to submit it to the Philip K. Dick Film Festival. The Philip K. Dick Film Festival? I mean, isn't that avant-garde science fiction and stuff? And she said, yeah, but, you know, my friend organizes it and he wants you to come and he wants to show it at this festival. So we did. We had a panel discussion afterwards, and good for Sarah, she actually got an award for best short documentary. And I think we have enough time to show this. I want to show the clip. Can I do that? Can I just do it from here? This is only a minute and a half or so. There is no internet connection. How can that be? Okay. thought I had the internet connection. We have a backup here, I think. Maybe I can do this. Okay, let's see if that works. Or, oh, you got it. Okay. How about the sound? There you go. Ain't technology wonderful when it works?
Sacarle a esto es cortarle, ¿no? Y uno se agrega acá un envase, se lo prende acá, entonces se va juntándose la leche. Es una medicina para purgante, ¿no? Y también para parásitos, todo tipo de enfermedad, ¿no? Es un grandes doctores de la ciencia vegetal, espiritualmente, tienen espíritu, son vivos.
Nature is a much better chemist than chemists are. Plants have been synthesizing compounds for, 250 million years or longer. They've created a tremendous unexplored repository of molecular structures that are far beyond anything any chemist could ever dream up. Okay, well, that's very short. I thought it was actually longer than that, but you can go to theshamanandthescientist.com, and I think the whole thing can be viewed now. So that was good. I mean, that was a way to kind of, in a way that's accessible to most people, bring attention to the fact that the Amazon and these other biodiverse regions are tremendous repositories of what are essentially undiscovered medicines. And this is one reason among many reasons why we should try to preserve these environments, and that species and the knowledge are both rapidly disappearing. So that is one of the crises that we face. Okay, so that's a reflection, and then this is what's been consuming my life for the last year. The ethnopharmacologic search for psychoactive drugs was originally a conference that was held in San Francisco in 1967, sponsored by the National Institute of Mental Health, of all things. The US government paid for this. 1967, the focus was not on this, it was on what was going on in Haight-Ashbury, right? This conference was a closed conference, very quiet, discreet, at the University of California at San Francisco. But all the leading lights of the day were there. Shulgin, Schultes, other ethnobotanists, Claudio Naranjo, various people, and they had this symposium. And the only thing the taxpayer ever got out of it was a book, the Symposium Proceedings. And that book fell into my hands at age 17, somehow. I don't know how it happened, but it was a real inspiration for me, because I could see that there was actually a field of science related to this work. And I thought, well, maybe I can be an ethnopharmacologist. And, and in my 17-year-old teenage brain, there was the, yeah, man, you can get paid to get stoned, right? Well, it took a long time to do that. It was a little more nuanced than that, but there was that idea of being able to, sorry. It's not supposed, it's all right already. It's not supposed to, almost done. But then that book was an inspiration to me at the time, and it was kind of a snapshot of the state of ethnopharmacology such as it was at that time. Well, I've wanted to do a commemorative symposium ever since. The government was supposed to do this every 10 years or so, but they stepped back from it. The war on drugs came along. They became embarrassed that they had anything to do with this. So the work languished and was noted by very few. Well, in 2017, it all came together, and we were able to, with the help of a lot of other people, I was able to organize a symposium in the UK at a place called Tyringham Hall, and we did the 50th anniversary symposium. And then from that, we republished the 67 proceedings and the 2017 proceedings. And so, we gave back. In 1967, live streaming was, no one would have known what you were talking about if you talked about live streaming. But in 2017, we were able to live stream all the lectures as well, and so those things are in a Vimeo archive, and you can look at them. And you can also, unless they're already sold, buy the book. Another shameless promotional slide here, but the book is in the book room, and this is the result of this work. So that's what I've been doing. That's how I've been spending my time for the last year, and I think this book is going to be a bit of a landmark, or at least a marker. I don't know if a landmark, but a marker of the state of the art of ethnopharmacology now, and there's still a lot to be done. You would think that people have been scouring the biomes of the world for new psychoactive plants, and that's true, a few, but there's still a lot unknown and a lot that's really not reported. So if you want to go into ethnopharmacology, and if you don't mind being professionally marginalized and working for very low pay for the rest of your life, go for it. It's, it's really a fascinating field, and there's a lot that we still haven't discovered in the world's biomes and even oceans. I've been very fascinated lately by some of the reports on psychedelic fish, which I don't think anybody's figured out what that is, except that they do exist. Nobody has any idea what the active ingredients are. All right. Thank you very much.
We're actually over time, but if someone has a burning, excellent question.
How do you find trusted sources of ayahuasca and ingredients? Well, I don't try to find it here as a rule. I go to South America, and I've been doing this long enough. I just work through networks of people I know, and it's kind of tricky. You kind of have to work through trusted networks and find good vegetalistas, good ayahuasqueros who know their plants and then know how to use it. So I've been lucky, but it's possible with a little research and the right kind of networking to find it, So, anybody else? Any other questions? Okay.
In the Brazilian Amazonia, a lot of the pages and the elders had passed on with the westernization of the jungle. A lot of the knowledge of the sacred plants is being lost. And I want to know, there's a few forces like Indigenous Celebration that are trying to protect that. Do you know of any other powerful resources or ways that we can make the population aware that the ecology of the planet is most important, and the destruction of the rainforest and the destruction of the sacred plant medicines, which is where all pharmacology comes from, how a network would be established, or do you have one that we can bank on that could get this information out for the protection of Mother Earth.
Right, well, yeah, I mean, there's certainly a need to make people aware of this, and there are many institutions or NGOs and so on that are trying to preserve the rainforest and preserve the ayahuasca species in particular. The one organization that I would really highly recommend you all check out, you know, their ethics are impeccable and their effectiveness is also, they're very effective, and that's ICERS. That's the International Center for Ethnobotanical Education, Research and Service. So it's ICERS.org. And both of those have kind of adopted, I guess you could say, ayahuasca and also iboga, to a certain extent peyote. And their primary mission is the preservation of these species, the preservation of the knowledge, the development of sustainable sources, and they also actually have created legal resources. They've created something called the Ayahuasca Legal Defense Fund, which defends practitioners who, for one reason or another, they come to from foreign countries to do ceremonies, and they get they get arrested or they get in trouble with the law. They have a group of legal experts that can help those folks. And ICERS is a nonprofit. They're very effective, but I urge people to support it if you can. They're doing very effective work. That would be the first place I'd go. So, thank you.
Thank you very much, Dennis.